Hello and welcome, everybody. My name is Jens Kettler. I'm with VOQUZ Labs, responsible for our GRC products. Today, we have a topic, access violation management. And we have a special guest, our very own Tomislav Limbevsky. Hey, Tomislav.
Hi, Jens. Hi.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Introduce yourself. What are you doing?
Yeah, actually, I'm supporting the REMQ for quite some times. And yeah, I'm in the customer success team. So it's nice to be here on this call, this webinar.
Yeah, so Tomislav will show us a demo later about what we're discussing today. Actually, not just a demo, but it's more like a how-to guide and do-it-yourself guide that everybody can implement in his own system, free of charge. So again, today we discuss access violation management, and maybe let's start with kind of a short recap what we mean with that. So the authorization concept in SAP and in all other systems, of course, aims at restricting access to only to functions that are required for a job on a need-to-know basis, so to say, both read access and also transactional access, and that not only for single activities, single transactions, but in some cases also for combination of transactions. So in some cases, you want to enforce a 4 eyes principle for certain changes, for instance, like in a workflow. And that's called segregation of duty. And also those segregation of duty rules can be violated, so to say. Not violated really by the SAP user in that example, but you have a business rule, you accept certain risks, and you have certain definitions how processes should run. But it's like based on the technology available in SAP or limitations due to team size and other things, it might be that you cannot really implement those rules. Could also be a mistake. Somebody was granted too many access roles. And in that case, users can execute transactions or combinations of transactions that the business would rather like not to have in the hand of a single user. But again, you would like to have a 4 eyes principle and a segregation of duty. The risks that come if you have this excessive, so to say, access rights, too many access rights, that's an insider threat. It's employees that actually have SAP users that have these authorizations assigned. It's not like somebody is hacking the system, no cyber threat. But you would like to restrict this or mitigate the risks associated with this. So while authorizations determine what you can do, this is rather about monitoring what was done, so a did do, which comes later. So transactions have already been conducted. And there's many examples, many case studies, if you will, how these risks can lead to actual financial losses. Most of these examples always come in the procurement area. We have a headline here, was published by the IRS in the US. And here, an accounting manager at a company created bogus vendors and then paid those vendors. And the violation that we have here is a lack of segregation of duties between creating vendors and creating a purchase order or entering an invoice or triggering a payment to the very same vendor. Because if it's a different vendor, you create vendor A and you pay vendor B, then probably there's no risk because somebody else might have created the vendor or initiated the payment, and actually there is segregation of duty. So very important that there is a connection between those two transactions, like in this payment or procurement cycle, it should be the same vendor. What's also something that we might discuss a little bit later is there's also other patterns that you very often see in these things. So lack of segregation of duty is one thing. What the person did in this particular case to hide a little bit what he or she was doing is he or she, I forgot if it's he or she, created vendors and vendor names that resembled existing and real vendors, so that it's more difficult to detect that this is unusual. Yeah, so don't use strange names and things where people are surprised that you're in business with them. Use the same name maybe that an existing vendor has, and and use that. So that's one pattern, similar names. The other is often increasing payments over time, maybe because greed increases, but maybe also the confidence in not being detected is larger over time. So the payments increase because you think it's little risk. I've not been caught. In this case, I think it was several years that this fraud scheme continued. And if you do this for a couple of years, probably you assume you will not get caught. All right, this would be a good time for the second slide. I mentioned authorizations. In many organizations, you use a tool to manage authorizations, something like GRC Access Control, SAP GRC Access Control, or there's also many third-party vendors that have similar functions. And those tools usually have one, like a matrix that we see here. Maybe we can enlarge that and have a look at the matrix here, which combines one, two, or even several functions together and say, access to this one function or to the combination of several functions is critical and should be avoided. And if it cannot be avoided, you should have a mitigating control in place. The examples here, and that's why I think I like this, is not from procurement, because we use procurement examples very often, because there it's very easy to see how you're going to lose money. But we have things here even from the SAP basis environment. So even in the SAP basis environment, certain functions should be not in the same, not assigned to the same user. And you see here, it's things about development, configuration, and transport administration. Other examples could be, it should be different users that create an SAP user and assign an authorization role to that user. Because otherwise I can create a user, give me SAP all authorizations, and can do whatever I want in the system. And it will not be controlled. There's no 4 eyes principle. So again, these access violations can happen both for single actions where you want to restrict access or for combinations. And we're going to focus mostly on the combinations of things. So if we monitor these access violations, we can do this on different levels. I already mentioned this SAP GRC Access Control SOD matrix that we looked at the previous slide. And that's access control and authorizations. They determine what a user can do. And that's, so to say, an access violation monitoring, if you will, on this level 1, what a user can do. You could also look at, did a user really use those authorizations? Did he start a certain transaction? Maybe the transaction to maintain vendors, or a transaction to enter or maintain purchase orders. If he started that transaction, that's what is denoted as level 2. Here in this slide, which actually comes from KPMG in the Netherlands, they invented this 4-level schema, I believe. I'm not sure if they invented it. They wrote a great article about that. The source is here on this slide, and it's definitely worth a read. So whether the user started the transactions would be level 2. And then you can even check if a user created vendors and entered invoices. That would be level 3. But what can happen there is that he created vendor A, entered an invoice for vendor B. There is no risk. So you will have too many false positives. We are looking today at level 4. That means the violation happens on such a level that you have a real risk associated with it. And in our example, creates vendor A, enters invoice, purchase order for vendor A. There's a real risk. It could be a fraud scheme. It could be that everything is fine, but you want to review the activity. So this is how, in principle, it works. As I said, Thomas Love will show it in the system in a way so that you can actually do it in your own environment. The information, and we stay with the example of vendors and purchase orders, the information about who created this object, the vendor or the purchase order, is stored in the tables that contain the data about the vendor or the purchase order. So we have 2 tables here. One for vendors, that's the table name is called LFA1, at least in the old SAP ERP systems, ECC 6.0. In the S4HANA system, the table is different, but you can still access this LFA1 and echo a table, so to say, via via views that exist in the S/4HANA system. So we're going to stick with these names because they will work in both products, both ECC-based and S/4HANA systems. So the vendor information in the LFA1 table, it contains the vendor number, and it contains the username who entered that. And the table about the purchase order contains, of course, the purchase order number. That's the red circle, and that's what you want to look at. In the end, if you investigate the case, it also contains the information about the user who created the purchase order, who entered the purchase order, and it also contains the vendor number. So that means we have all the information here in these two tables to perform an analysis whether that was the same user. Yeah, you can put these two tables next to each other, so to say, and match where the username is the same in both tables, and also the entries where the vendor number is the same. If both are the same, you found actually a case where one user entered a vendor and entered a purchase order for the same vendor. I know this will not cover all the cases. We're going to briefly discuss change documents after the demo, but I believe in most cases, this is already a good approach to do this type of analysis. And in particular, it's very easy to do. And Tomislav will run you through this do-it-yourself homework that everybody can do. And you can do this in a very similar way, not just for vendor and purchase order, but for all sorts of these violations where the data is stored in such SAP tables. Tomislav, to you.
Yeah, thank you, Jens. So basically, as it's written in the slide here, so there are quite some simple steps which needs to be done. So first, you need an access to the SQA transaction. Then the next step is to create a new query, actually to add the name to the query, add the description, add the tables, then select the fields in the join. But let me show you how this looks in the system actually. Okay, let's go to the SQA transactions. So this is our SAP environment, and I'm adding here the transaction name, which is SQA. So here, as mentioned earlier, we need the name. So let's name it test SOD1. Then one can just click on create. Here is the title of the script, test SOD1. The data source, which I will select in this case, we will table join. And now we need to add the tables in the query. First, as mentioned earlier by Jens, we will use the LFA1 table, which contains the data stored, the general data for the vendor which is created in the system. And we will use the table echo, which contains the purchase order data. And in SAP has stored the data for the purchase order in two tables. One is echo, and the other one is ECPO, which contains the details of the purchase order, where all the line items are stored. We are not interested in the ECPO for this particular case, but we will focus on the echo where our data is stored. So by default, SAP has linked the two tables via the key, which is the vendor number. And if we scroll down, you see that this is done automatically. But in order to actually see the segregation of duties when they occur, we need to add another link. And by link, I'm just thinking of clicking on the right button of the mouse and linking it to the table from LFA1 to the echo. And now we have the link in those two tables by these two key fields, which are the vendor and the user who created the entries in the two tables. The next step would be to go back, and now here we have a folder structure where we have the table join, where we can see the LFA1 table and the echo table, but also we can see that we have certain columns which are called list field and selection fields. If I expand this button, this table, we will see all the fields which are contained in this particular table, which is LFA1, and we will select the list fields. So first, let me define what the list fields are. The list fields are the fields which we usually see in the reports which you run by SAP, and the selection fields are the fields by which we filter out the data, or we filter out the unnecessary data for our selection. So in my particular case, I will just select the list fields from the LFA1 table, which are the account number, the name of the vendor. Then I will choose the person who created it and when it created the document. Yes, so it's here. Now I need to select also some list fields and selection fields from the echo table. So for this particular case, I will choose the purchasing document number as a list field. I will choose the company code as a list and a selection field, because we might want to run this report for a certain company code. And I will also select as a list field and selection field the purchasing document category and the purchasing document type. Why those? Because by purchasing document category, we can further define whether we want to look only at the purchase order, or we want to just check the schedule agreements or contracts. And then we can further refine our search by selecting the purchasing document types. In case we just focus on the purchase orders, then we know that usually there are different types of document types used for different types of transaction, but we will focus only on the standard. And now we select also the user as a list field, the creation date as a list field, and also as a selection. The next step here is to run on execute field. Now SAP has generated the program which will run the query. And now we are into the selection field of this report. So I will just use the dates from 1st of January 2020 to 31st of December 2024. I will run the report, and now, as you can see, we have received a list of SOD conflicts. Here we have on the first column, we have the supplier, its name, the user who created, when it was created. Then we have a purchasing document, which was created by the same user which created the supplier. In which company code, what was the type of the document, the document, purchase document type, and also we can see the user that created it and when. For this purpose, I would like also to double check whether the data here displayed in this report is actually true. Therefore, I will just select the purchasing document number. I will open a new session, and I will type in the ME23N transaction, which is a transaction used for display of purchasing documents. Okay, now I'm pasting here the document number. This is the document. I can see that it was created by the user R18. In the report, yes, it's R18, and it was created on the 22nd of 2022. Okay. And yes, with this, we actually identified documents which were created by the same user and the same document by same user, where he created the purchasing document, and also he created the vendor for this supplier. I think, Jens, we can go back to you.
Thank you very much, Tomislav. I think those were very valuable 5 minutes. I mean, of course, Tomislav knew the table names for vendor data and the table name for the purchase order data. If you don't know this for another combination of SOD conflicts that you would like to check, maybe like change of prices and something else, or discounts, just Google it. You will find the table name, and the rest of the process probably is exactly the same. You choose 2 different tables. You connect the usernames and the vendor number or the customer number or whatever else, and you see that this result was there within 5 minutes. I think this should be in the toolbox of every SAP authorization consultant, and also of every auditor in organizations that use SAP. And the program that was generated by Tomislav by just connecting this in this graphical interface, that program still exists in the system afterwards. So you can always go back and run it at any point in time later when you want to do that. So you build your own repository of these SOD controls. I think that's an excellent tool. Thank you very much, Tomislav.
Thank you.
It's a great tool. It's not a perfect tool. There is something missing. The fields that Tomislav connected were those with the user that created the objects. Often you will also find fields that you could also use for the user who did the last change. But if the object is created and then changed again by another user and then changed again, the changes between creating and last change, they're kind of lost, or let's say the data is not there in the table. Changes to such business objects are recorded in so-called change documents. A change document in the end is also a table. More precisely, one change document is entries in two tables, in the CDHDR table, change document header, and in the CDPOS table for the different positions for changes. Here you see the details of the change. So the header table contains the user who did the change and the object to which the change was done, and the details of the change in the CDPOS table. So for a complete analysis, you need to take into account that as well. We have these screenshots here, how these table entries look like. Quite simple, but unfortunately, there is some information missing. In particular, the information about the vendor here cannot be correlated between the different tables. It is not always there. And that means that you need, in the example of purchase order, you need to go again to the table that contains the purchase order details, the one that Tomislav just used in the demo, the echo table, because there you can find the vendor for which this purchase order was entered. So the analysis becomes more complex, maybe still can be done in the SQVI, in the query viewer from SAP. Again, that's a standard transaction in all SAP systems, but will be more complex. And yeah, maybe not for everyone. I don't know. It's part of our tool. We have a tool for business transaction monitoring, and all these scenarios there are covered. Now, we had just one example. I mean, this was in the procurement process, but there is many other risks and many other things that you can look at if you want to really secure your procurement process. That starts with sourcing. When you onboard a vendor, I mentioned that in this case that we had on the first slide, the user decided to use very similar or even the same name as existing vendors to kind of hide the activity. And there could also be an approach. If you look for duplicate vendors, you might also find bogus vendors. Also, changes to vendor master data are critical. So, of course, in the end, if you really want to secure the system, access violation management and detection of these SOD violations is important. But there are other tools you should also have in your toolbox that complement this approach. And then you have these different SOD controls that you could do between the vendor creation and the purchase order or the invoice. And finally, then going further to the accounts payable and the payment process. Also there, you have things that you can test. And you should have a library of these controls available that help you to monitor this whole process and detect things that look suspicious or not regular. I mentioned it's not complete, and here two very specific things on these violation of segregation of duty. Sometimes it's not so easy to detect because collusion, that means two people working together, or maybe you can say it's involuntary collusion, some sort of social engineering can be used. There was a case at Amazon, the online retailer, and there a manager instructed someone in the team to create a vendor. So that means the vendor creation was done with another user. And in that case, there is no link on this user level between creation of the user and entering an invoice or approving an invoice, for instance. So that's difficult. That's why it's also important to have these other checks about detecting suspicious vendors, suspicious payments, suspicious amounts, or maybe the increase in business. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes at the beginning, users start small with maybe small transactions, then they gain confidence in their fraud scheme, and also they might become more greedy and the amounts increase. And that might be patterns that you can detect. It is possible to detect collusion. Again, two users working together. One approach could be that you look at the vendor and the two usernames that you find in the vendor master data and in purchase orders or invoices, and you try to detect whether it's always the same users working with one vendor, for instance, like a cluster, so to say. But the details there really depend on your organization and your process. If you have a very small purchasing organization, these clusters will be given just by the fact that you have very few users. If you have a large organization, then these clusters are kind of more likely an irregularity. The other thing this is also something to consider. There is ways you can change data in SAP, and the changes are not recorded. There's no logging, and that's this famous debug and replace. So a developer or someone with development authorizations can do changes in the SAP system that where you don't have a trace, and then data analytics fails. And also there, you can still try to find something, but you have to look at different patterns. Next slide maybe, because I mentioned so often now you have to look at different patterns, and we already saw the whole procurement cycle. So in the end, what you want is to cover end-to-end a whole business process, like procurement, for instance, and then have different types of controls on master data level, unusual user activity, SOD violations, and so on and so forth. And so you need a larger library of these controls. They need to run often. And that's what, for instance, our RAMQ tool does. It comes with a large library, can be deployed very quickly. And you can also analyze historical data, so from last year, for instance, which is also something that you can do with the SQVI approach that Tomislav showed. Maybe that's something I would like to emphasize here also. If you're an auditor, maybe sometimes the SAP Basis team does not allow you to use SQVI analysis and reports in production. That's usually fine because your QA system probably is a copy of the production, so it has old data. If you go there, then you can run this analysis for an old period. And if you have findings there, then I'm sure there's reason why you can say, look, we need to run this in the production environment as well, because you have proven that your analytics works and gives results that help to reduce risks in the business. Questions around this or everything else, we're happy to take now. So let's jump into a quick Q&A session.
Before you jump to the questions, I might go over to a little survey for all of us to check where we all stand with the topic on access violation management.
And who wonders who's this voice? It's Stefan who is producing the webinar in the background.
Exactly, it's the man from the background. Yeah. So what we will do is we have 4 questions in a row out of a survey. It's anonymous, so don't worry about the compliance. So we don't see who clicked what. It's just about being straightforward where we stand, and you're going to see what I mean when I put on the first question on the screen. And it says, what we're interested in is, do you use SAP GRC Access Control or a similar tool for now? Do you use that in your company? I'm going to leave this question open for yes and no selection for the next 3 or 4 seconds, and then we're going to have a look at the results before we go over to the next one. So
SAP authorization concepts sometimes become messy over time. You develop a nice concept and it looks great on paper, but then you add roles. You add roles to users, you don't remove them, and very often that leads to the fact that users have too many, so to say, authorizations.
Let me show you the results before we get on. Hang on a second. Yeah. I'm going to put it on the screen, and here we go. 71% say yes, actually.
Yeah, I think without a tool, you cannot manage the SAP authorization roles. So a tool kind of is mandatory. Question is whether it's sufficient. Even using a tool does not mean that everything is kind of perfect.
Yeah. It depends on how you use it. Like with everything in life. I'm gonna go over to the next question, and it states, do you have a process in place for recertification of SAP authorizations? I see a spelling error, but we still know what it means. Do you have a process in place for recertification of SAP authorizations? Yes,
Yeah,
and or no.
not sure.
And while you talk, I'm going to play the results then, Jens. Sorry for interrupting
Yeah,
again.
so recertification means, I mean, you assign roles at a certain time. Yeah, somebody picks up a new role or a new job, you assign authorizations, and then sometimes it is kind of forgotten that you also have to remove authorizations from time to time. For instance, if somebody moves on to a new role in the company. And so that's the recertification process, is something where you continuously review whether the assigned SAP roles are still required for the job. I think it's a kind of standard tool, so to say, a standard process.
It seems to be a standard process, but still not on full. So it's 67% yes and 33% no. I'm reading this out because this won't be in the recording that we're going to send out to you. So don't mind me reading this out to you guys. And yes, just answering a question here, we will send the link to a recording out to you so you can have a look at this. Sorry for jumping in there, Jens. So going to the third one out of 4. And it says, do you have a tool to detect and monitor access violations such as discussed in the webinar? Do you have a tool in place that detects and or monitors violations such as discussed in the webinar? I'm going to leave this open for another 4 seconds from now. Feel free to click away. And it looks like, Jens, there is some upgrade potential here. I'm going to show you the results. It's 33% say yes, we do, and 67 don't. For what reason ever? Didn't find the right tool, didn't think it was necessary. What's your experience on this?
I think there's not many tools in the market for that. I think the approach that we showed is a very simple way to do this yourself, so to say, do-it-yourself instruction. It's not perfect to do it like that. As we mentioned, you're lacking certain changes to these business objects in your SOD analysis, but it's like according to the Pareto principle, right? It's this 80-20 approach. So with very low effort, you achieve a lot.
Last one out of the 4, and this is a suggesting question actually. So we say not monitoring access violations creates a gap or a blind spot in SAP authorization concept. Do you agree with that? Do you think not monitoring access violations creates a gap or a blind spot for your team, for your company in the SAP authorization concept? I'm going to leave this open for another 4 seconds from now. And to be honest, I'm hoping for a 100-to-0 ratio here. Let's see what happened. And it looks like we all agree on this. Look at that, 100% say yes, 0 say no. So that's, I'd say that's sort of comforting in a way. What do you think?
Stefan, did you manipulate the data? No, that's good. I think yeah,
I retyped it. It was 50-50 at the beginning.
It should be really kind of obvious after what we discussed here.
Excellent.
But we have some other questions.
Yes, we do. Thanks for participating in this. We're going to be sharing this also in the follow-up, so you see where we all stand with this. It's not representative. It's just for us to get a bit of a touch on it. So people sometimes refer on, well, this doesn't represent certain departments. Of course not. It represents the audience that's in this webinar now. So the first one that we have here that came in via the chat is, how can this be built in GRC CCM?
Frankly, I'm not sure.
Yeah. Is that one for Tom, maybe?
Really, maybe I can look into that and come back later, try to provide an answer by email or offline. Right now, what I would be able to say probably is wrong. So.
Okay. Well, fair enough. Fair enough. It's a good input. So let's check that and get back to the people. and we'd rather have the answer correct than mumble around to try and see and find an answer that's not there yet. The next one is, I'm going to read it out as it is a bit of a longer one. Can you explain again why one needs to include change documents in the analysis when the tables contain the user already? So what's the trade-off here?
Yeah, maybe Tomislav, or shall I? So the tables usually contain the user that created an object, yeah? And often they also contain the user who made the last change to that object, like vendor master data. But there could be many changes in between the creation and the last change, and those changes, or the user that performed those changes, that is not in the table, but it's only available in the change documents. So you have an incomplete picture using only the tables. That's why we said earlier it's a not perfect approach, what Tomislav showed, using this SQVI, this simple SQVI analysis, using just data from the tables. You have this blind spot for certain changes that might have occurred. But in many scenarios, probably this approach using just the data from the tables is already good. Yeah, so that's this 80-20 principle, low effort, and you still catch many scenarios, not all of them. So if you want to do it correct, you have to include change documents, but then it gets a little bit messy because some data is not in the change documents, as we mentioned, and the SQVI query or any other way of analytics that you would do is more complex.
Excellent. And while you're talking about changes, I'm going to pull up another question that came in later, and it actually fits this one. It says, are all changes in the system recorded in the change documents?
No.
Yes.
You go, Thomas.
Yeah, yes and no, actually. Yeah, the most critical tables in SAP have the change log activated, but also there are a lot of tables which the change log is not activated, but it can be done afterwards via specific transaction to which can record it. So yeah, the answer yes and no.
Yeah, yes and no is a good one. So go ahead, Jens.
Change documents, I think there's around 1,500 or so types of change documents in a typical SAP system. You can create additional ones, but not all the changes are recorded, only for what SAP calls a business object. Changes to customizing tables, for instance, are not recorded in change documents. If you want to see that, you need to activate table logging. Table logging is a standard feature in SAP systems that you can activate. By default, it's switched off. And its intent is to monitor changes to customizing tables. So not to application tables that contain transactional data, because that would create a very, very large amount of data for changes. So it's very, very, it's just like looking through a keyhole if you look at this information that is there.
I've got another one that's a bit technical, maybe more about cross cooperation within departments. And it says, how do you balance SOD or access rights with people like SAP solution architects who needs to oversee the whole system landscape and not just a particular system? So how would you distribute rights to them, like say SAP All or SAP New?
Yeah, SAP All. So SAP All is just because it's a technical thing, maybe not everybody knows. SAP All is a authorization profile that contains all authorization objects in the SAP system. So it's a very powerful authorization profile, and usually people would say, do not use SAP All authorizations because everything is contained. A user who has that can do everything. SAP New is something that is relevant during system upgrades. Yeah, but I mean, I know that sometimes people have something like SAP All, but I think nobody will say that this should be used. Every auditor will mark this as a high risk finding and will say that SAP All has to be removed from user profiles. Usually an SAP solution architect, something like that role, I think that user does not really need many authorizations. Maybe he only needs read authorization in particular. So, and with read authorizations, you have much less risk exposure. In principle, you could come up with access violations where somebody has too many read authorizations, like in the HR system, he would get access to all the personal identifiable information and so on and so forth. So that's also not without risk, but it's different, yeah. But I think, I don't know, I'm not a solution architect in a user company. I think those users don't need a lot of authorizations usually.
Thanks for this. Before I come to the last question, if you guys have any more that you don't feel, it's maybe too complicated to be answered here live, or you don't want to do that, please feel free to send us an email to labs@voquslabs.com. We're going to distribute that to Jens and to Tomislav. And they're also pretty active on LinkedIn if you prefer that line of communication. Also, if you're missing out on a topic that you think we could or should cover, with REMQ, with any type of access control topics that we didn't cover so far, please feel free to contact us. And you might actually end up with your topic in the next pipeline in the VOQUZ Labs webinar. While I was talking, 2 came in. Here we go. I had to read this twice. Would firefighter would not be an option when high privileged access is required? Probably pinging your answer now, Jens.
Yeah, firefighter is a feature of certain GRC products, such as, I believe, GRC Access Control, and some other products have the same concept. It means you can request additional authorizations to perform certain tasks, and they will be granted for a short period of time. And you can perform then things that you usually don't have authorizations for, and then the additional access rights will be removed again. I think that's a very good approach, in particular because you exactly know what authorizations were granted, and you can actually go and test what the user did with those authorizations, because it's a limited amount of time and a very specific authorization that was granted. And so you even have an easy way to test and review the changes that the user performed with those authorizations. So that's a very good concept.
We have another one, which is basically an input where someone feels we didn't talk enough about mitigating controls in SAP GRC, so people missing out a little bit. Is there something you can add to that before we get back to that colleague individually, Jens?
Yeah, I think the idea was, and we had one slide about that, like you have risks in SAP GRC Access Control, like for instance, you have this SOD matrix, which is a standard business content in GRC Access Control. And if you have an SOD risk in access control, then how do you handle this risk if, even though the SOD combination is kind of marked as risky, as high risk, how do you manage that risk? And this is the approach that we try to explain, that you can monitor these access authorizations using this approach that we just demoed. So it was like you have the risk in SAP GRC Access Control, and this is a mitigating control for that risk. Hope that's clear.
And if not, I've just sent a private message here, and if anyone else feels like that, we're going to come back to you individually if this wasn't a sufficient or in-depth enough answer. We read those comments out as well. This helps us to sort of evaluate the content of the webinar, and we won't be able to cover all the topics in depth for everyone who sort of joined. That's not so unusual. So feel free to ping us. And also make suggestions if you feel there is something missing generally, as I said before. That's it from my side. Let me check on the other platform. No, that's it from my side. Thanks everybody for joining. Thanks for participating in the little survey. Thanks for the questions, which makes it interactive and interesting and highlights things we maybe didn't think of. Thanks to Tomislav and Jens. Your words on the webinar before we log off?
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Stefan, who is sick at home today, but nevertheless helped us to run this. Thanks.
You're very welcome. Tom?
Thank you.
Cheers. Bye-bye. See you next time. Thank you.
Bye-bye.